Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. We have a good turnout today. Once again, this is our fifth hearing of the Assembly Blue Ribbon Commission on ECE, and we're excited to be here at our state capitol today for our fifth hearing talking about the financing of ECE, I guess you could say the billion-dollar question or even more. Yes, I know we've been around the state. We had our first, of course, hearing here about a year ago, and we've been to a few other cities, and now we're back. Our next hearing will be about looking at access issues, but today we're focused on the financing piece of it. We know that's a critical component, but we know that money isn't everything. The systems are important. What's in the setting, whether it's a family provider, a center, a school district, those are all important components. But we want to make sure that we look at the economics of how we make this work in California. So we have an exciting panel here today. I know our speaker is going to be here in a moment to join us as well. Do we have any opening comments from anybody? Yes, Assemblymember Rubio.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I know we've been taking our commission on the road show, is what I call it, and I think it's very important for us to go to the different communities and hear input from everyone that's involved. As many of you know, I'm a former teacher, and I understand the importance of early childhood education. I was a kindergarten teacher, so nobody knows better than the kindergarten teachers.
Yes.
And so I appreciate the conversation, and I think that with the panel here of fabulous, amazing people, I think we can further the mission instead of just having these conversations. Hopefully, after we have a conversation about funding, I think we can come up with some good processes and procedures and, some tangible outcomes so that we can move forward and really have our communities be better because of our efforts. So thank you to the panel for being here, and I look forward to a robust discussion, and hopefully we can continue and, solve every single issue tomorrow. Yes. So thank you.
Okay. Assemblymember Reyes.
Thank you so much. I also want to welcome all of you. I'm so glad to be part of this commission. It's such an important commission. It's something that we are preparing. This is the preparation. It's our report that will provide the blueprint for what we're going to do in the future. Without a doubt, we're looking at lots of crucial issues. One of the most important, you're right, it's not the only one, but such an important one is that billion-dollar question, the billion-dollar issue, and making sure we do find the money. We know that there are some groups that have found ways to bring everybody together, and that's what's important. So I'm really looking forward to the presentations, and I'm glad to be part of this group of very distinguished champions for early childhood education. Thank you.
Okay. All right, with that, we will begin. Before we have our panel today, we wanted to allow a few individuals to just give us a flavor of why pre-K is so important, early education from the ground level here in the capital city of Sacramento, my hometown, of course. Excited to see my locals here. We have our new superintendent of the Sacramento City Unified School District, Jorge Aguilar. Thank you for joining us here today. And Donna Hoffman Cullinan, who's the campaign director of early learning for Moms Rising, and area mom of two pre-Kers as well. So thank you. We'll start with you, Jorge. Thank you for joining us here this morning.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone, Assemblymember McCarty, other members of the state legislature, and to every one of our commissioners. I'm very excited to be here. My name is Jorge Aguilar. I have the privilege and honor of serving as superintendent of Sacramento City Unified School District. Our district is made up of 77 schools with over 46,000 students, and we operate early childhood centers at 45 of those schools. Those are in the form of Early Head Start, State Preschool, Head Start Preschool, as well as a state-subsidized and fee-based school-age children's center, and any combination thereof. We serve about 1,883 students, so just shy of 2,000 students at those programs. I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about Sac City's guiding principle, which is that We are determined to give every student an equal opportunity to graduate with the greatest number of post-secondary choices from the widest array of options. Now, that's a guiding principle that we've established and that we're very committed to, and I will be the first to admit that the focus on post-secondary choices sometimes has us focused on the back end of our continuum. That is, how do we make sure that we graduate more students than are graduating, and how do we make sure that more of those students that are graduating are completing the A to G course pattern. But I'm here to argue that we have to spend an equal amount of time talking about what we're not doing as effectively on the front end, and that what we're not doing on the front end, we pay for on the back end. So I'd like to share a little bit of information to prove this point. We're very excited that we have initiated a full redesign of what used to be known as our summer school program. Summer school used to be a program that was, again, focused on making sure that more students graduated, those that weren't on track to graduate. Because we know the importance of kinder readiness, third grade readiness, the transition years of 6th to 7th, 8th to 9th, we have redesigned our summer school program focused on a philosophy of opting out, which means that we've identified current kinder students that aren't on track to demonstrate kinder readiness. And we've now gone back further and identified those students who are struggling to demonstrate kinder readiness who did not attend an early learning program. And about 50% of the students that are struggling did not attend an early learning program. Now, again, we could choose to invest the limited resources we have at the back end to make sure more students graduate, but we've been doing that for many, many years. And I live on the mantra that every system is perfectly designed to get us the results that it gets us. So we have to fundamentally shift the paradigm, focus a great deal of attention on the back end, but begin to focus more attention on the front end, which is why I'm very proud that our Board of Education has fully committed to fund this very unique summer school program that will serve students as early as kindergarten who are not on grade level, going into first grade in the fall. The opt-out philosophy entails the principle that we have now notified every one of the parents and guardians of those students that are struggling as kindergartners that we've essentially pre-registered them for summer school. And we have to receive an opt-out form from a parent or guardian for us not to see the student during the summer. But we are convinced and committed that to the extent that students start their fall semester, day one in the fall, closer to grade level readiness, going into kindergarten and first grade, that will save us a huge amount of resources, both human and capital, as the students progress in their careers. I also want to mention a little bit about what you said, Assemblymember Reyes, which is funding. Funding for these programs has increased over the past 3 years. In 2016-17, the total amount we invested was $21.5 million to serve just shy of 2,000 students. In 17-18, it was $23.3 million to serve 1,883 students, so about 100 fewer students. And in 18-19, we expect that cost to be almost $24 million. In fact, we are slated to invest about $2 million from our general fund to cover the difference in cost to run the same level of programming. Now, we also know that we have a wait list throughout Sac City Unified School District as well. And it pains me when I learn that a student is unable, because of capacity issues, primarily due to funding, not to enroll in an early learning program, given the commitment that we have made to make sure that students are demonstrating kinder readiness, first grade readiness, and third grade readiness. And I'll just leave you with that fact that if 50% of our students who are struggling did not attend an early learning program, in the urban setting, most of us would celebrate if 50% of our students complete the A to G course pattern. That's a very high percentage of students, still 1 in 2, but I would much prefer to see us not hit a plateau in that 50%. Celebrate because we're hitting 80, 90% A to G completion rates, matching our graduation rates, and I believe that we can accomplish that if we invest much more heavily on the front end. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Assemblymember McCarty. And thank you to the Commission for inviting me here today. As Assemblymember McCarty mentioned, I'm a local mom of 2, and my name is Donna Cullinan. I'm also California's campaign director for early learning with Moms Rising. We are a 1 million-member grassroots organization championing policies that strengthen women, children, families, and our economy with about 100,000 members here in California. And as you all know, 100,000 is another important number for us here in California. It's the number of infants and toddlers who don't have access to high-quality early learning opportunities due to funding and lack of space. And that's the reason we're all here today. Moms Rising is so appreciative that the Blue Ribbon Commission was formed to strengthen policies that lift up California's youngest learners. And we know that parents in the Golden State desperately need a boost and change to best support their children. Access to affordable, high-quality early learning opportunities like childcare and preschool are critical in a window of time where 80% of a child's brain is developed. Yet in California, we have a crisis of both access and affordability. Right now, only 14% of California's eligible infants and toddlers ages 0 to 2 have access to public-supported affordable childcare opportunities, forcing their parents to make difficult decisions about where they leave their children when they go to work. Compounding that, the price of infant care in California costs families more than in-state college tuition, which a barrier so high that many families face horribly challenging dilemmas for care. The price tag on child care is even more troubling when you look at the impact on low-income families. Here in California, for a family of 4 living near the poverty level, it would take 95% of their monthly income for child care for 2. Which is just unacceptable and unattainable for all families in California. And with over 20% of California's kids living at or near the poverty level, our state desperately needs change. We stand at a moment of unmatched opportunity to build a system that supports all children and families in our state. We also know that 60% of California's early learners speak more than 1 language at home. And we have an obligation to create early learning opportunities that work and meet the needs for all of our families, including access to dual language learning in the earliest years. Our state has always been a beacon for change and progress, often the example that others point to, yet unfortunately our commitment to our youngest kids does not always lead the way. Even though our economy ranks 6th largest in the world, California still has the 2nd worst standard of living for children in the nation. But California's growing and strengthening economy means that it's time for us to put our youngest kids first and fill that void that was created for childcare funding during the Great Recession. It's also no surprise that high-quality early learning programs produce a 13% year return on investment through improved results in education, health, social behaviors, and employment. I'm happy to see such a passionate, committed group of champions here today with the Blue Ribbon Commission, and I look forward to the great work that comes in the next couple years. And thank you again for having me here today.
Thank you, and thank you for setting the stage. We have a panel coming up of a researcher, practitioner, and an academic. We're looking forward to hearing that. But before that, we wanted to allow our Speaker of the Assembly, who 2 years ago, when we were putting together this budget for ECE, thought, you know what, we need to step it up and invest more, but think more about the long term, what we can do to look at our framework and systems here in California. So, Speaker, thank you.
Thank you, and I want to obviously thank Assemblymember McCarty. I want to welcome all of the colleagues, the commissioners, presenters, and stakeholders. I want to thank you all for being here and for your interest in the work of this commission and for your commitment, obviously, to early childhood education. There's a lot of familiar faces out in the audience. Kevin and I met a long time ago when we were both working in early childhood education, so it's good. This feels like home. Yesterday I spoke at the 20th anniversary of First Five, And I noted that in those 20 years, First Five has been an enormous resource for parents and policymakers, and have really helped to shape the conversation about the vital importance of 0 through 5. It's amazing how far attitudes have come. It's amazing how far research has come. Not only research with respect to what we've learned in the classroom and sort of applied research, but research with respect to brain development and all those types of efforts. But we still have a lot to do, especially when it comes to financing. And that'll be obviously the focus of today's hearing. This is our 5th hearing since I established the Blue Ribbon Commission a year and a half ago. And I'm exceptionally pleased with the hard work of this commission and all of its members. And I'm excited that the commission is on track to make some important recommendations to the legislature early next year. And thanks for coming today, and let's get on with it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you again for our first presenters. And can we bring up our panel now? Yeah. Stacy, can you switch up the name tag? Thank you. I think we're going to start with Lynn Caroly, a senior economist from RAND, who's been working in this field for quite a while. And it's great to see you again. I met you when you were doing another one of these PowerPoints a few years ago. So,
yes, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for including me in this hearing today. I'm going to be speaking about a study that was done by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And the report was recently issued called Transforming the Financing of Early Care and Education. I was a member of the committee along with Celia Ayala was also another member of the committee put together by the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine to conduct this study. This was a national effort to look at the financing for early care and education, but I think many of both the findings and the recommendations have relevance for your work here in California. Just want to briefly mention that this study was sponsored by a number of public and private entities, and I think it speaks to the fact that this is an issue that is deeply relevant across the country, both at the federal level, but as well for states and localities. The National Academy of Sciences studies always begin with a statement of task, and I just want to briefly summarize that this effort by our committee was designed to look at the issue of financing for early care and education for children from birth to kindergarten entry, where that early care and education would be accessible, affordable to families, and of high quality, and delivered by a well-qualified and adequately supported and compensated workforce, consistent with the vision in an earlier National Academy study, which many of you may be familiar with, called Transforming the Workforce for Children from Birth to 8. So while that study specifically looked at the workforce from birth to 8, this study is going to be specific to children prior to kindergarten entry. The vision on the part of the committee that produced the Transforming the Workforce report was to achieve high-quality practice in the early care and education setting required high-quality professional learning needs and opportunities to support the knowledge and competencies of practitioners, as well as the leaders in the settings where they deliver early care and education, practice environments and working conditions that provide the resources and tools needed to support the well-being of practitioners in the ECE field, as well as supportive policies for professional learning in the practice environment. So with those underlying vision for what a high-quality, well-compensated workforce would look like, our task was essentially to look at what the cost would be to provide a system that delivered early care and education, birth to kindergarten entry, as well as to think about issues for how one would fund that system and the mechanisms by which any resources raised to support such a system would be delivered. So I want to say a few words about terminology to kind of set the stage for our effort. First of all, by early care and education, I'm referring to paid non-parental care and education provided outside the home for children, including child care and early learning settings across that 0 to kindergarten entry or age 5 spectrum. So this is intended to cover the paid care that's received in both center-based settings as well as home-based settings. And specifically, when we talk about the workforce in those settings, we're referring to the practitioners themselves working in home and center-based settings, such as the educators, lead teachers, for example, their assistants and aides, as well as administrators in those settings, such as directors, and those who support the workforce in their professional development, such as coaches and mentors. In the United States, there are currently about 130,000 centers that provide care for children from birth to kindergarten entry. Within those centers, there are about 1 million paid ECE workforce members. An additional 1 million members of the ECE workforce provide care and early learning in home-based settings. So our study is intended to apply to those approximately 2 million practitioners in the field providing paid care through home and center-based settings. Another term that I want to define is what we refer to as financing mechanisms. These are the methods by which funds are distributed to entities, stakeholders, if you will, in this system, whether they be providers or families, the workforce, or the system as a whole. So, for example, when we talk about funding mechanisms that are provider-oriented, it means mechanisms such as contracts or grants where the funding comes directly to providers. Head Start being an example. In California, it would be Title V programs. When we talk about mechanisms that are oriented towards family, those are cases where you would have vouchers or tax-based preferences so that families are the recipients, if you will, of the subsidy to pay for early care and education. There are also examples of mechanisms that are directed to the workforce, such as various kinds of grants or stipends that may be used to support their professional development, as well as targeted pay incentives such as wage supplements for achieving a given level of education. And then system-wide, we're talking about mechanisms that are directed to support larger system efforts like quality rating and improvement systems, data systems, and so on that affect the entire ECE system for children in these ages. When we think about the landscape currently in terms of early care and education and financing, as I know you are well versed in these issues now, we have a system that has multiple sources of funds raised at the federal, state, and local levels through separate programs where those programs often have different standards with respect to quality, eligibility, which types of providers can receive those funds if it's provider-oriented, and a variety of ways in which the system today is extremely complex. In addition, funding comes not only from the public sector, but families contribute as well. And by our estimate nationally, families are contributing about 52% of the costs of providing ECE for children from birth to kindergarten entry. And I think another thing to point out in terms of families' contributions, the data we examined and report on in our report show that the lowest income families who contribute toward ECE, when they do so, it's typically a higher share of their income compared to higher income families. In other words, the burden is greatest on those families who can least afford to contribute to the cost of high quality early care and education. In doing our work of the committee, we established a set of principles for high-quality early care and education that provided a foundation for us both to examine the current system and identify where there were gaps or shortfalls, but also to guide a set of recommendations that I'll talk about later. We also view these principles as ones that are relevant for other entities in undertaking the kind of work that we did on our committee, trying to understand the costs of a system and how one would pay for it. So I think these may be relevant for your work in thinking about the objectives that you're trying to achieve. And I'll say a few words about these 6 principles. The first principle says that high-quality ECE requires a diverse, competent, effective, well-compensated, and professionally supported workforce across the various roles of the ECE professionals. The system fails to meet this principle in several ways. First of all, as I'm sure your work has shown and the work that we did on our committee shows, compensation for ECE practitioners is low. And that's true whether we're talking about teachers with bachelor's degrees, as well as those who play supportive roles, those in leadership roles. And that's a drawback in terms of our ability to attract and retain the workforce that we need in order to deliver the highest quality opportunities for our children. Second of all, the current workforce-oriented financing mechanisms, such as the kinds of supports that California has had to encourage those who might not have a bachelor's degree, for example, to go back to school, those financing mechanisms do not create predictable and steady sources to either boost the salaries of the low-compensated individuals in the field, as well as to recruit and retain them so that we build that high-quality workforce. And then finally, where we have financial supports for ongoing professional development, and in California that includes those that might be available through the quality rating and improvement systems at the county level, for coaching, mentors, and so on, those supports are also ones that are not sustainable, provided on a limited basis. So again, they do not reach the entire workforce in a way that encourages and builds that high-quality workforce. The second principle states that high-quality ECE requires all children and families to have equitable access to affordable ECE services across all ethnic, racial, socioeconomic, and ability statuses, as well as across geographic regions. Again, our current financing structure fails to achieve this objective. I mentioned a moment ago that families currently pay for about 52% of the total cost of ECE, and families with the lowest incomes spend about 20% of their income on that care and early learning, while families at the highest income levels pay only about 6% of their income. So we have this inverted system of families least able to pay, paying a larger share of their income. Even for families when they qualify for subsidized ECE, such as through Head Start or in California, Title V programs or subsidized childcare, those families are not all families who would be eligible for those programs are able to receive assistance because the funding simply is not sufficient to serve all families who qualify. And then finally, the lack of harmonization across different funding mechanisms, whether we're talking about Head Start, state child care assistance programs, and other state funding, such as Title V in California. Those mechanisms lead to gap in affordability for low-income families, as well as underutilization by middle-income families, many of whom would not qualify but still face the same issues about affordability in their access to ECE. The third through sixth principles, rather than going into detail, I just want to emphasize that effectively they speak to ensuring access to high-quality care in a range of settings. And here, in particular, the principles focus on the need for adequate and sustainable financing with incentives for quality, in other words, linking financing to high quality, financing for a variety of service delivery options. That means a system that would allow for mixed delivery, such as center-based and home-based settings, and adequate financing for facilities and for the system-level supports that are needed. Those are often neglected aspects when we think about financing for a system. And the current system, again, fails to meet these remaining principles in several ways. First of all, receipt of funding typically is not tied to quality. Many of our funding streams are not expecting families to be able to use them in high-quality settings or link the receipt of particular reimbursement for care to the quality of the provider or the setting. Second of all, the level of supports that is provided to providers, whether we're talking about home or center-based settings, is typically not sufficient to cover the costs of high quality. So even if a provider has a funding mechanism that's oriented toward them, a grant or a contract, families have vouchers to pay for care. Often the reimbursement levels set through those mechanisms are not sufficient to cover the costs of high quality. And finally, in many respects, we don't have financing or funding streams that support the system-level resources that are needed to provide the oversight and accountability and data and other ways in which we see that we have at a system level a high-quality system that provides access to families and a well-qualified workforce. So another objective for our committee was to develop an estimate of the cost of delivering high-quality ECE with a well-compensated workforce at a national level. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on our process or our particular numbers because they were developed to be a national estimate rather than one specific to California. But I think the exercise that we went through provided some important findings that I want to highlight, and also to indicate that the process that we used, the strategies, the approaches, the assumptions are one that at a state or a local level could be replicated to see what the consequences would be beyond the national level. I do want to say that in estimating the cost for high-quality ECE at a national level, we had several objectives. One was to account not only for on-site costs, so the costs of a provider, whether it's a center or home-based settings, but also to account for the system-wide costs. And so you can see on this chart the kinds of on-site costs that we wanted to be able to capture. So staffing as a major cost element in providing ECE, but also tying that to assumptions about staff quality and their compensation, other ongoing professional development and supports, the facilities themselves, for example, and then at the system level to be able to capture costs associated with workforce development, quality assurance and improvement systems, data systems, and so on. So again, the goal was to be as comprehensive as possible. And we also wanted to tie our estimates to the findings of the Transforming the Workforce report in terms of establishing the type of high-quality staff that we were envisioning, as well as the compensation to go with it. So just to say a few words about that, we assumed in our settings that we would have lead educators with a bachelor's degree, as consistent with the Transforming report, that those educators would have ongoing professional support for their development through resources for coaching, mentoring, and so on, that the professional staff would have paid release time to allow them to engage in this professional development, that there would be resources to support children with special needs in home and center-based settings, and that providers would have non-child contact time that would be used, for example, for planning, for assessments of children, for meeting with parents, ways in which they were supported in those additional activities. We did come up with a number, so for those of you who may have seen the report, our estimate nationally for the U.S. on an annual basis was that the cost of a high-quality ECE system would be about $140 billion. Now, for some that may seem like a large number, others it may be hard to place in context. I think one way to contextualize it is to say that over the 4 phases in which we envisioned a system being phased in, by the time you get to the final phase or the end goal, the system would be spending about the equivalent of 0.75% of U.S. GDP on early care and education. This is just about the average for other high-income countries in the OECD. So this is certainly a reasonable estimate given what we see other high countries doing in terms of their investments in this area. In addition, we can also place it in the context of K-12 education. Serving children from the age band from 0 to kindergarten entry represents, in this case, about 1/3 as many children as are served in the K-12 system, yet we would have a system that would be spending about 22% as much as the K-12 system as a whole. So spending fewer resources per child than what we see in the K to 12 years. Another consideration, once we had that estimate of $140 billion, was to then investigate how one could think about the sources of funding to pay for that high-quality early care and education. And of course, one source is the public sector, whether that be federal, state, or local funding. But we also wanted to consider the possibility that families would contribute, much as they do now, to early care and education. And there are a variety of approaches for figuring out what's an appropriate or affordable amount for families to pay. Of course, one approach is there would be no fees for families. Think of that as our current K-12 education, publicly funded K-12 education system. One could have the same kind of system for children from birth to 5. But assuming that families were to contribute, there are a number of ways to think about the fees. And we did that by considering families' payments at the lowest income level would be nothing, as a way not to have any barriers to them being able to participate in high-quality ECE. And that family payments as a share of their income would rise as income increased. You could think of this as a progressive system for allowing families to contribute, but doing so as a share of their income, where that share would start out low and gradually rise, as opposed to the current system I talked about, where we're seeing the highest family payments at the low end and declining as family income rises. So our report then shows estimates of what the share would look like for families, what it would look like for the public sector. What I want to conclude with are some of the key recommendations that I think are particularly relevant for your work, both around financing and around the workforce. The report does have 10 recommendations in total. I want to speak to a few of them. They are grouped by recommendations that are specific to an effective financing structure, to sharing the costs of the contribution would be expected potentially from families, for planning for a transition from the current system to one that would have a more equitable, sustainable financing system with a high qualified workforce, transforming the workforce itself, and then recommendations around assessing progress and quality. So again, I want to just focus on a few of these given time, but would be happy to talk about others in the follow-up. First of all, with respect to an effective financing structure, the first recommendation refers to the fact that we expect there would be a role for the federal governments and state governments to establish consistent standards for quality so that we have a more unified system in the way that we approach support for early care and education, that funding would be tied to quality regardless of the funding mechanism that is used, and that state and federal financing mechanisms should ensure that providers are receiving payments that are sufficient to cover the total cost. So these are three issues that I addressed earlier in our current system that need to be rectified. The second recommendation speaks to financing with respect to affordability for families. In this case, one of our recommendations here was that families would not be expected to receive access to subsidies for ECE based upon their employment status. In the current system, receipt of some funding is tied to employment, such as child care subsidies, whereas others are not. Head Start, state-funded pre-K programs do not typically look at a family's employment status in determining eligibility. So we thought it was important that employment status not be a criteria for eligibility of receiving public subsidies. We also, in a third recommendation, looked to states in particular as a mechanism for addressing these issues from a system-wide perspective, and that states would be engaged in a process, much like you are here, of developing the mechanisms, the understanding of their current systems to be able to move toward the type of system that we envision. With respect to costs and sharing the cost, the contribution on the part of families, we recommended that funding, whether it be at the federal, state, or local level, would need to increase in order to support the high-quality system that we envision, and that if we expect families to contribute, that it would be done in such a way that families at the lowest income level would pay nothing toward the cost of care, and the share that they would contribute would rise with income, much as the system that we modeled as an illustrative example. We do envision a planning process in our estimates. We did not assume you could achieve the type of system we envisioned overnight. And so there was a recommendation specifically for processes to work toward that transformation. With respect to the workforce, we recognize that there's a need both to think about the incumbent workforce as well as future workforce members. And so we want to acknowledge the need for the workforce to receive financial assistance with respect to increasing knowledge and competencies in the field, whether that's through qualifications, through higher education, credentialing programs, and other forms of professional learning. And in particular, that the incumbent workforce should not be burdened with the costs of achieving that improvement in their skills, qualifications, and competencies. We also recommended that existing, as part of that workforce transformation, that resources and support would be targeted specifically for the incumbent workforce to develop their qualifications, and that other supports would be available, financial and otherwise, for the workforce that is moving into the field in order to ensure that they are not unduly burdened with the cost of acquiring the education and skills they need as they move into the field. Particularly when the issues of compensation are addressed, this should become less of a need because the compensation will be sufficient in recognition of the degrees and competencies of the professionals in the field. We also had recommendations specific to the institutions, post-secondary institutions that provide education and training, and the need to boost their quality as well as the financing of those systems. So think of these as the issues around curriculum and the particular settings where ECE practitioners in the post-secondary education system acquire their skills and learning. And likewise, that states, colleges, and universities need incentives in order to ensure that their programs are of high quality. And then finally, we have recommendations about the larger system to ensure that there are the supports for research and evaluation to assess whether or not a transformed system is achieving its goals, as well as other data collection requirements that would be needed to monitor and ensure the accountability of the system that we envision. So in sum, I think key messages that come out of the National Academy's report include our well-founded understanding now that high-quality ECE is critical for children's positive development and has the potential to generate significant economic returns, that our current financing structure is inadequate to support the recruitment and retention of a high-quality workforce and to incentivize movements towards higher quality, that our current system is inadequate with respect to ensuring that all children have access to high-quality ECE, regardless of their family background, and finally, that the total cost of providing access to the type of affordable, high-quality system that we envision is one that will indeed need new resources from the public sector, even if we expect families to continue to pay a share of those costs. Thank you very much for your time, and look forward to any discussion that follows.
Thank you very much. We will stop here and entertain comments or questions on this presenter, or we can proceed. Yes, Commissioner Olenek.
Seems like I ask you questions in Washington and then I ask you questions in Sacramento. So in your comments, in your presentation, I didn't see anything about family, friends, and neighbors. And in talking to Celia, she says there was information about that. And I wonder if you could comment on the whole notion of improving quality in family, friends, and neighbors, which is a really very intimate kind of thing that goes on.
So that's a great question. So the issue is family, friend, and neighbor care. And I assume by that it's important to differentiate between those care providers that are unpaid and those that are paid. So our study did include home-based care that's provided, could be family, friend, or neighbor, but if it's compensated care, paid care, that is covered by our study. And it's covered in several ways. One, all of our estimates of the number of families that use care, the amount of care that they use for infants, toddlers, and preschoolers, all were based on estimates that included home-based settings, family, friend, and neighbor care. It could also be those who are formally licensed to provide care in home-based settings, such as family child care homes. So that range of paid care providers in the home-based settings is captured. What is not captured is the part of the workforce that is uncompensated. And some of that may be provided in home-based settings, a child's home or another individual's home. And that was just partly a limitation, a constraint on our work, and that we were charged with looking at the paid system. Now, it's entirely possible with the transformation that we're talking about that we would draw additional individuals into the ECE workforce, some of whom may be currently providing uncompensated care, and that those same opportunities that we describe for becoming a well-qualified member of the paid workforce would be open to those individuals who currently today may be providing care in those settings on an uncompensated basis. We have some understanding of what might change in terms of families' use of care. So if we eliminate the barriers in terms of the cost of care to families, we may expect to see more families move into the more formal part of our ECE system, which potentially has the advantage of moving children into these monitored, regulated quality systems. Many families, though, may still choose to use care that's uncompensated family, friend, and neighbor care. And that's going to be a function of their underlying needs for care. They may be using a combination of care from the more formal system and the informal system, depending upon their needs. So I hope that answers the question about where it's captured and why we would expect a system, in a complete system, to continue to include some of the informal care that we see used now.
Okay. Yes, Commissioner Ignatius. And again, can you do this? Yes.
I want to follow up because I didn't really hear the piece about exempt care providers included in the home-based setting. So I'm glad to hear that it sounds like they are.
Yeah, so just again to reflect, there's 1 million individuals who are providing care in home-based settings that we're including in our view of the system.
So one thing I wanted to, also lift up, because you also said you want to de-link employment with need, and actually I really agree with that. But the jobs that a lot of families, particularly low-income families, have access to are these jobs that are in restaurants, retail, hospitality, medical fields, home health aides, and a lot of these high-quality early learning programs are not offered sort of during those non-traditional hours, on nights, on weekends, with schedules that are varying. So where in the vision of this ECE system do you see a place for a significant number of families who don't have access to those programs, particularly in their communities that reflect their communities?
So I think a couple of answers to the questions around the need for non-standard care hours. First of all, the system that we're describing does still include home-based care. So families with those needs for non-standard hours may continue or may, choose to use home-based care providers. And again, this is a system that we're envisioning where if you're in the paid high-quality workforce and you choose as a provider to offer care during those non-standard hours, that would be, part of what this system is that we're envisioning. I think another aspect of the system that we are describing is one where, because providers would be compensated for their cost of care, that we would expect providers to offer more options for care during non-standard hours, recognizing the cost of that provision. And one barrier now is that it's harder for providers to differentiate and receive reimbursement to reflect those differential costs. So we certainly recognize that will be a need on the part of families that will continue. Similar kinds of issues in more rural settings versus urban settings in terms of care access and availability. That means we still want a system that allows for a diverse array of settings and provider types. We just want to see that it's high quality and delivered by a high quality workforce, and one where that workforce is well compensated and providers are compensated for their costs.
Thank you. Assemblymember Reyes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. In much of the literature that we've read on you talk about this leveraging, and it was one of your conclusions or recommendations, number 7, specifically on leveraging existing funding sources at the state level to enhance quality for the ECE workforce. Is there something that California funding specific that you can enlighten us on, that we can use for the leveraging, grant programs or the like?
Right. So what I think the basic goal that we were thinking about in that recommendation was that we wanted, as we first tried to understand what resources were currently in the system and the funding available. The current system does have multiple funding streams, federal, state, even at the local level. And what we would like to do is to see a system that is more harmonized, more unified, both in the side of establishing, for example, standards for what constitutes quality, but also in the way in which resources could be better pooled together and used for supporting this larger system, both for the direct care provision as well as the larger system costs and for supporting the workforce. I don't know that I can identify a specific mechanism in California that we might have had in mind, but there are some states that are putting forward resources to use for purposes of investing in their workforce. That may be part of their state preschool program, for example, where they have resources specific to workforce development, workforce transformation. And so we wanted to see that those would be resources that would be captured as well and available to this larger system.
When examining the state's role as a coordinator of sorts for the various entities working within the ECE field, what administrative structures would need to be changed or put into place to make this more effective?
Well, I would say that our committee did not get down to that level of specificity in terms of what that might look like, in part recognizing that states often approach these issues around sort of the infrastructure, the ways in which that is established. So examples would be around governance issues in the states now. To the extent that states have been investing in state pre-K programs, the governance structures that they've put in place have varied quite considerably, whether they house that in their Department of Education, in a social services department, establish a new department, have some way in which that effort is housed within an overall governance structure. So we rather view this as something that the states would determine what are the needed mechanisms in place to enable that kind of coordination and harmonization of a system. And some states may be far enough along that they think they already have that infrastructure, governance structure in place. Others may need to have more time to think about what that would look like. And again, it's going to depend in part the history of where they've been, along with where they're going to.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Macmillan?
Thank you for your presentation. So one of your key assumptions, you had mentioned lead educators with BA degrees. Can you tell me how that relates to family child care?
So again, going back to the Transforming report, that was our foundation in terms of their recommendations. They specifically recommended that going forward, in whether you're in a home or center-based setting, that there would be a BA level educator as part of the provision of early care and education. In family child care settings, that may take a number of different forms. And again, I think partly we need to look to research to understand what high quality looks like in those settings. So it may be that in a family child care home where you have a small group, that provider may have a bachelor's level degree, and what we're also talking about is compensation that goes along with that. Another model may be one where you have groups of family child care homes working together and supporting structures such as a BA level individual who would be supervising or supporting the family child care providers in their own homes if they do not themselves have that level of degree. So there's different ways in which you could structure this. That may be a state level determination or a funding stream level determination as to what that specifically looks like. We had to make a number of assumptions about ratios and things like that in coming up with our estimates. And in doing so, particularly with family child care homes, we weren't necessarily assuming that you would have that BA level staff person in every family child care home because of the issues with ratios, but it could be a shared model like the one I was just describing.
May I ask what research, what groups were involved in this decision making for family child care?
So I'd refer you to the earlier National Academy of Sciences study called Transforming the Workforce that was specifically looking at the workforce skills and competencies and recommendations about what a high-quality workforce would look like. They extensively reviewed the literature around education levels, other skills and training for the workforce, and that was their concluding recommendation, which our committee was then given as a foundation. It wasn't up to us to redebate that consideration or open back up the issues that went into that recommendation. I would urge you to look at that report more specifically because they are quite considered in terms of the evidence that's available now, the need for further understanding around the role of degrees versus other ways in which we support the workforce in terms of their skills and competencies through other professional development mechanisms. And there may indeed be a period of transitioning the workforce from our current workforce today, many of whom do not have those degrees, particularly in family child care settings, to ones where they're provided with supports during a transition to a workforce with the expectations that those coming into the workforce would have those higher skills and competencies. Again, with our recommendations around the support for attaining those degrees and the compensation that goes with it. And so that, I think, is a way of viewing that combination of degrees, support for degrees, the work that you do in the field, and the compensation that's received, to align them in such a way that we can have a high-quality workforce in both home and center-based settings.
I guess you can tell by my face I'm not really pleased with the findings in this, being a family child care provider who does not have a bachelor's, who has an associate's degree. So this would be a major upheaval in this field that I love so much, and 65,000 other family child care providers in this state love so much. And so that's why I ask you, who did you talk to? And you referred me back to this association and this study, and I am going to look into that because I don't think that their findings clearly represent family child care and my sister and brother now providers who do this work every day and are passionate about this work. So, but thank you for being the messenger. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think I gave terrible instructions to my commissioners. What I meant, if you have a question, I'm a horrible teacher right now, not giving instructions. So if you have a question, go like this so I know who to ask, who to call next. Assemblymember Rubio.
Thank you. Yes, my comments are in line with what you're saying, because I have many child care providers that do provide excellent care and an excellent foundation for the kids. Now, as a former teacher, I can tell you, even in the school setting, preschool teachers are under the classified designation, not necessarily certificated, and then the difference between a certificated position versus a classified is about, it's the Common Core math. It's about $30,000 difference. And if you have a bachelor's degree, and I've been out of school since 2003, and I'm still paying my student loans, I'm trying to provide for my family, and on top of that, pay for a student loan. If we have additional burdens, because really the degree doesn't necessarily make somebody provide better education or services. There is a big disconnect, and I feel like, and again, you are only the messenger, but the comment would be is placing additional burdens would lessen the pool of qualified and passionate providers. And so how do we reconcile that? The information is great, and we can all agree that that's great, and that is awesome in an ideal world. And we're here because it's not an ideal world. So if we can figure out how to maybe reconcile that information to the realities of what's really happening right now, it would be great. Appreciate the information, appreciate the messenger, but I do agree with the comments about, how are we going to place these additional burdens, and are we going to have enough providers that have those qualifications? Thank you.
So I think just in response, the thing I would add is that, again, looking at our recommendations specifically to the workforce, that our recommendations revolve around not increasing the burden on the workforce in terms of degree acquisition. So our recommendation was specific that those who are current incumbent members of the workforce would pay no costs toward achieving any degree requirements that may be in a new system. And second of all, that for those coming into the workforce, that there would be an alignment between what they would be expected to contribute and their expected salaries. So particularly in the current system with compensation that's low and inadequate, that would imply greater degree of subsidy just to achieve the degree attainment. Once you see the transformation that we're describing here of a workforce that's compensated, consistent with their degrees, consistent with other practitioners teaching, for example, kindergartners in a public school, that if you have equivalent degrees, training competencies, that you would be compensated accordingly, that might imply more of the upfront costs to acquire education might be borne by the individual, but with the expectation that they would be compensated accordingly, just like other individuals attain higher education with the expectations that the fields they move into will allow them to pay back their student loans and so on. So I think that it's the combination of what we're recommending, looking specifically at expectations for the workforce and their skills and competency, degrees, credentials, the compensation that goes with it, and that whatever setting they're in, that their reimbursement through any public subsidies would recognize that compensation, the other costs accordingly, so that you won't have the shortfalls that we have today that don't allow for high quality provision because the reimbursement structures are not consistent with providing high quality.
Thank you. Commissioner Campos Rivera.
Thank you so much for the presentation. And I feel like my question has already been answered, so it'll be more of a comment, I guess. Very helpful. I think the data that's before us and the research that's before us is going to really help inform our thinking. Obviously, there's going to be some areas where we're going to scratch our heads a little bit more and wonder how can we address those issues in California. I think as we talk about BAs and what lead teachers should have, and again, more of a comment reinforcing what's just been said, I think it was Illumina Foundation that put together a really good study on what prior learning looks like. And I think that's really what this body and members of the legislature are going to really have to grapple with, and really think about those competencies. And in addition to just the BA, we know that there's, teachers or early ed teachers, providers, caretakers that have been doing this work for 30 years and are fabulous. They don't have the BA. But if we got to that North Star, because we should think North Star, I agree, especially as we talk about workforce, but as we have those conversations, really thinking about prior learning and really taking into account that level of experience, those years of wonderful experience that you have and that you're able to contribute. So I think that's one of those things that this body is really going to have to grapple with. How do we incorporate prior learning and really invite members of the commission and the audience to really look at this report? And again, I think it was Illumina Foundation that did it, that looked at other sectors outside of education and what other sectors, business sectors, are doing in addition to just the BA, but that are going to put them up high on the salary piece as well. So thank you.
Commissioner Boothie.
Thank you also for this report. I think it's very helpful. I think all of us up here are taking that $140 billion number and trying to do the math and figure out what that would be in California.
Yeah, $1.4 billion.
All right, there we go, $1.4 billion.
We have a $10 billion surplus.
There we go, fabulous. I'm curious because you talked in the very beginning about three buckets almost, right? The cost of the early care and education, the cost of the workforce piece, and the cost of the state mechanism. Of this $140 billion, does that work out in what percentage falls under each category? I'm curious. Probably maybe you didn't do it out that way, or if you did percentage versus phase in. I'm just curious how that worked out on a national level.
I can tell you just off the top of my head that the system level costs were about 8% of that number, the $140 billion number. So most of it is in the direct care provision. How much of it is tied to sort of the workforce transformation, I'd have to go back and look. But again, it's going to be a relatively small share. Much of that is the direct care provision.
Okay, if we could get that number or that percentage, that would be really, really helpful.
Yeah, look for it.
Thank you.
And I will note that there was a math error. So California is about 10%.
I was going to say, it's about, it would be 14.
It's 14 billion. Yeah, but we have.
I didn't want to correct you, but
that's
yes.
Okay. But yeah, I was getting excited. Oh, we can do 1.4 billion.
Sure.
Commissioner Ayala.
Thank you, Lynn, because it's a very complex issue. It's big picture. But I just want to have us as commissioners think of aspirational, that this is not going to happen overnight, that those of you who've been around for a long time, I see some friends, I remember when kinder was not a mandated, it still is not, but where teachers did not have a credential, and it's taken us all these years to get here. So just a couple of premises, because we have these very heated, and I'm talking heated discussions, that we're not talking about displacing the existing workforce. We actually need more. That we're talking about no cost should be incurred by the existing workforce. We're talking about over time, phasing in over maybe a 10 or a 12-year process. We're not talking about making sure that people's expertise and experience are discounted, because we're going to need that. We want to make sure that our children are cared for and educated, and we know that those people that have had a lot of experience, if they can demonstrate through competencies or pathways, that's a decision that California needs to make. This is a national report that was based on another report that did talk specifically. They had a lot of recommendations from NACRA, which is the National Resource and Referral Association, and a lot of other groups in terms of research that had been done with home care. There was also, the previous report was not only education, but it dealt with social work and health providers as it related to the 0 to 8 population. So I want us to think not what is, but what should be. And that we think about not the barriers today, but how we get those pathways, career pathways, our harmonization of funding in a way that gets us there. And I want to go back just to Ms. Blanco's, well, actually it was Eloise's, Reyes's question. There are some models that are working for us, but they're small. And right now we might be investing, I don't know how many billion, but as you said, Mr. McCarty, we need 14 more billion. And I think Michael had said 10, but I like your number better. 14 billion to get us to where we need to be, but it's going to be over time. And so I don't want us to become discouraged. I want us to become encouraged and excited about the possibilities, because for me, after all these years, I see the light. I really do, at the end of that tunnel. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And just a reminder, this is what this Blue Ribbon Commission's about, is to look at the North Star and be provocative and think, where we are today and where we should be. But I will note that these issues, as far as the education level in the BA, we do know, we've talked about Head Start. They're making this change. And one of the reasons that you brought up why it's hard is because so many people in the field, one, they're doing a great job. We don't want to push them out. It's having some recognition as you transition, whether it's a grandfather clause or what have you. But say it's hard because people in the field are getting paid, In-N-Out Burger, Costco wages. Well, why do we pay those poverty wages for their workforce? And so I think that's a piece too, as we look at, properly setting our rate structure for the programs. Then we can acknowledge that issue, and then I think you can take a look at education levels and what it costs and so forth, because the research does show that it has an impact on quality. And if you want kids to show up in your former kindergarten classroom and get ready to learn day one, then this is a reality too. So with that, great presentation, good discussion. We will now move on to Professor Menendian. Close?
Menendian.
Okay, Menendian, yes. Assistant Director and Professor Research at the Haas Institute at UC Berkeley. Thank you, and welcome to the State Assembly today.
Thank you, Commissioners and Chairman McCarty, not only for having us here, but for your attention on this very important issue. Critical brain development occurs before age 5, and yet the United States ranks 26th out of OECD countries in the fraction of 4-year-olds that are enrolled in pre-K, and 24th in the fraction of 3-year-olds. But I'm not here to present on this substantive issue. I am here rather to discuss a policy framework for you to consider that we think might be very helpful as you consider your recommendations. And that framework is what some Theda Skocpol at Harvard calls targeting within universalism, and what we call at the Haas Institute targeted universalism. So this framework is an equity framework, but it is not a policy and does not substitute for a policy. And in fact, it's not a strategy. Rather, it's an approach by which equity strategies may be derived. And it also expresses a commitment to both process and equity outcomes. It's an alternative to the binary trap of either targeted or universal policies. So I'm going to try and briefly run through those and then open up for some questions. Part of the challenge is that this trap of targeted versus universal creates a false binary that we need to actually find our way through. So universal policies are those that aspire to serve everyone without regard to group membership, status, or income, and they tend to set a uniform either set of benefits or a goal or set of minimum protections. So, for example, single-payer healthcare systems, or the popular thing these days is the universal basic income, which is a policy approach that would provide a benefit of equal amount to everyone regardless of income. So the wealthiest individuals would receive the same benefit as the poorest. And so the idea of universal is that it really means everyone. So sometimes policies are devised that have a universal scope or framing, but are actually trying to solve a targeted problem. And the FMLA is an example of that. And its original impetus was to provide leave for families with pregnant parents and new parents. And in its ultimate expression, the law actually allowed anyone to take leave, including caring for elderly parents or siblings. So it's an example of a universal approach with a targeted problem. Now, one of the problems with universal approaches is that universal approaches actually have a tendency in many instances to exacerbate inequality. So in the initial CDC study of the Massachusetts universal healthcare, the so-called Romney Care approach, the CDC realized that while expanding insurance coverage to everyone, the differential access to healthcare itself actually expanded the racial gaps in access to care. So I'll show you a couple of slides on how that can model out. But first, let me define targeted. So a targeted approach, in contrast to universal policy, would be a policy that targets specific populations based upon their characteristics or demographics. And so in this case, there's a recognition that there's a problem, and then the policy proposal or solution is tailored to that problem. So examples might be the Americans with Disabilities Act, which not only prohibits discrimination and requires equal treatment, but also requires special accommodations, including easements, entrances, and parking. And so you can think about different policy solutions that might fall into the universal versus targeted framework. So you could compare a universal basic income with a negative income tax, which would be conditioned on income, or SNAP versus a single payer approach. So one of the problems, as I already mentioned, with equal treatment or universal approaches is that it doesn't actually get everyone to the goal. So this is a meme that's circulated on the internet quite a bit, and there are a number of images like this that illustrate that problem, right? That equal treatment does not actually get everyone to the equity outcome. So here's another slide that can show how a universal program can do this. So consider, for example, that you have two groups, and they could be racial groups, gender groups, any group-based characteristic, and you have a universal program, and the universal program extends benefits equally and treats members of each group the same. But for members in the shaded groups, they live in neighborhoods that, say, for example, are isolated from jobs. And so a job training program would actually free the people who now have the skills to secure the jobs, whereas the people who don't have transit to the jobs, who don't have access to the jobs, while they may have the human capital, they aren't able to actually secure those jobs. And this is the problem the CDC identified in Massachusetts, which was that actually having insurance doesn't give you access to a healthcare provider. So what is targeting universalism, and how can it actually solve this problem? This is a lot of text, but let me just say that basically it's an approach that supports the needs of the particular while reminding us that we're all part of the same social fabric. So it rejects a kind of universal blanket that's indifferent to how particular groups are situated in society. And it also rejects a kind of formal equality that actually creates a disparate impact. So in its most simplified form, what it means is setting universal goals and then pursuing those goals with targeted processes. I'm going to walk you through a step-by-step framework to show how you do this. So the first step is you have to establish the universal goal based upon a broadly shared understanding of the problem. The second then is you assess the general population performance to the universal goal. So it can be anything. It could be math proficiency. It could be English proficiency. It could be access to healthcare. It could be access to early high-quality education and childcare. So the first thing you do is you need to do a kind of general performance assessment. The third is then you begin to look at subgroups, and you identify groups and places. So it's not just communities or populations, but you also need to look at geographies to see how those places and groups are performing relative to both the overall population, but actually more importantly, the goal, right? Because the goal should not be to get, one group to where the best performing group is, but rather every group to the goal itself, right? That's actually a key distinction. And this is actually the most important step in a target universalism framework. It's to then assess and understand the structures that either support or impede each group or community from achieving the goal. So you actually have to conduct an analysis to understand what is it that's holding folks back. Now, it may be barriers, it may be challenges, it may be a lack of transportation, it may be a lack of supports, but it might also be that in some of the communities, there are a set of proactive, affirmative structures that allow folks to advance to the universal goal. So it's not always a barrier so much as it may be the absence of resources or capacities. And once you've developed an assessment and analysis, then you need to begin to develop and implement targeted strategies for every group. So a universal blanket strategy that treats everyone the same will actually fail to get you to the universal goal. And so this is actually the critical part, is you might have a myriad or plethora of strategies, but those strategies are necessary to get everyone to the goal. And that is the heart of the target universalism framework. The framework is a focus on universal goals, but it's a recognition that you need targeted policies to reach those goals. Now, just a couple of caveats or notes on the framework. Targeting within a target universalism framework does not always mean targeting people or even populations. It often does, but not always. And of course, there are limitations within California. There's Prop 209, and I could have a whole separate seminar on that. But the heart of targeted universalism is actually targeting institutions and structures. So I can give you a couple of examples. One of the places that has operationalized target universalism is the city of Austin in Texas. And what they did was they did an assessment, and their goal was to make sure that every resident in the city lived within or had access to green space and could live within a half or quarter mile of a public park. And so they created a GIS map, and they assessed where residents lived relative to the green spaces, and they created new green spaces, right? That's an institutional approach. As opposed to moving people, you actually create green space where people are. So the focus isn't on people per se, it's actually on the institution, structures, and systems. That doesn't mean that a target universalism approach always targets institutions or structures. There was a program, a very valuable program implemented in Baltimore called Vision for Baltimore. It was a program launched by the city health department based on a recognition that 15,000 students in the school system who needed medical care, specifically they needed contact lenses or glasses, weren't getting it. And you can imagine how that was a barrier to actually learning. And so they provided a healthcare program that both screened and then provided that resource. So in that case, you're actually creating an institutional program that does target people. But the point is that more often than not, a target universalism approach will focus on systems and structures and institutions. Finally, in implementing a target universalism approach, it's important that you not just bring together the experts and the legislators and the commissioners, but that you actually bring together the people from the communities who are affected, and that you monitor the programs to make sure that it's achieving the outcome and you make adjustments over time. So implementation and evaluation are vital. And that's it. There's a video, which a 3-minute video that just goes over this. I won't show right now, but if you'd like to look at it, please check it out. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner Hamady.
I want to thank you for this report. This speaks to our heart, because this is what equity versus equality is that we're talking about. And I particularly love the fact that in your recommendations that it is important to talk to people who need the services in order to find out what they need. Because oftentimes in our professions, we kind of figure out this is what people need without actually reaching out to them and finding that out. So thank you. This was great. I would like to get the PowerPoint.
Okay. Thank you. Commissioner Ignatius?
Hi, this is amazing. I actually learned about targeted universalism because we brought a group together to look at what it would take to bring a race, class, and gender analysis to the ECE system. And it was our incredible consultant, Tammy Johnson, hopefully you hear me. She raised this to us, and it's so often the conversation we're not having. And oftentimes we are creating programs that the very people who we're trying to target cannot get to, and then we penalize them and we demonize them for somehow not, jumping over or through or under 100,000 hoops to get to it. And I really believe that this commission is really committed to taking this approach to make sure that we don't do that, and that a future system really considers and understands what the needs are of who we are trying to target. My question to you, where should we start? We've talked about a needs assessment. We've talked about doing focus groups with families. If you were, advising this commission, well, I guess you are, where would you tell us to start?
Yes. I think both of those places are vital starting points, and you can't do one without the other. You need to look at the data and see where the populations are, the subgroup populations are within the state of California, but you also have to do the qualitative side. You have to meet with groups and find out, especially as you devise the strategies, what are the actual barriers and structures that are allowing some groups to advance the universal goal and holding others back.
Thank you. Commissioner McMillan?
Yeah, thank you for that. I had never heard of targeted universalism, so you just educated me on that. And not knowing that being a part of the labor movement, we kind of are already doing that, especially with family child care, because we work out of our homes. And so for us to even find out about our union and what we have to do, it has to be brought to us. Is that how it works? Am I doing a good comparison, or am I not?
Well, I'd have to hear a little bit more, but I think that part of what we're suggesting here is that to get everyone to the universal goal requires a multitude of strategies, and one size actually does not fit all, and that one size fits all, an approach that's just singular or universal can actually exacerbate inequality. It can make things worse. And so I appreciated what Gail had to say about harmonizing approaches, but also being flexible is part of what I heard. I think that the trick, though, with targeted universalism is that it's not actually just targeted, that you're actually thinking about the universal goal. And we think about inequality, we often focus on getting, say, what Latinx students or African American students to where white students are. But in many places, what white students have shouldn't be the goal, right? We're trying to get everyone to the universal goal. And so there really is a distinction between targeting, which might, in some places look like an affirmative action strategy, and actually getting everyone to the universal goal, which means creating the supports and the ladders and the capacities to do that. So I think you're there.
So you really are shifting a paradigm, so to speak. So
that's right.
It's like bringing the dartboard to the dart.
In some cases, it can.
I'm a
be.
dart player,
Yeah.
so that's why I'm okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. We'll move on now with Graham Dobson.
Good afternoon, Assembly members and commissioners. I'm Graham Dobson. I work at the San Francisco Office of Early Care and Education. We're a recently formed office where we consolidated all of the funding that was for 0 to 5-year-olds in San Francisco under one roof. So whereas previously we had 3 separate city departments sort of working with those funding sources, we brought it under one roof as an office of ECE. And recently we've implemented a new funding mechanism for our early care and education system in the city, which we've called our Early Learning Scholarship. So I think it's just an example of something, to give a model of what what we're thinking is of how to expand access and also especially to high quality environments. So just some context, I think as a model, San Francisco is difficult because we're a pretty unique place, as we're both, we're a city and a county, and we only have one school district. And we do have some significant local investments in early care and education through some set-asides and tax dollar set-asides that come to ECE specifically. So we have a lot of local investments that we can use, which isn't always the case in other counties. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I think you all know we're a high-cost county. Rents are ridiculous, and it's really hard to do business there and to live there. But we do have about 44,000 children under the age of 5 as part of our population. This gives a little bit of a breakdown of the income of the families that are within those 44,000 children. The yellow is our children, both infants and toddlers and preschool age, who are under the state subsidy eligibility of 85% of the SMI. The SMI doesn't really work in San Francisco because it's a state median income, and that doesn't really work with us. So, we've been working in our office, not just looking at the state subsidized eligible families, but also what we call our low to moderate income families, who are between 85% of the SMI and 110% of the area median income, which is a significant difference when you look at the AMI as opposed to the SMI.
Can I just ask you a quick question right there? And I'm sorry, my Assembly member, Mr.
I know,
Ting,
he would be the perfect
He told me that he had said hello, he had to go back to San Francisco. But they say the joke that the last person with a family closed the door on the way out of San Francisco. What you're showing here is that you're seeing that right here for 0 to 2. It's different from 3 to 5, right?
Yeah.
So you're seeing that the newer families are already, the income is higher, correct? So,
correct. So and then the green here is families with income above 110% of the AMI. So currently, our target population within our system that we're funding locally, just because even with our money that we have locally, that's flexible, we don't have enough to serve every single universal infant, toddler, 0 to 5 preschool access. We don't have that. So again, our target is up to 110% of AMI within our funding system. So I guess our overarching goals really are to increase funding to the programs to provide, to really cover the actual costs of providing high quality care. We know that a lot of the programs that are receiving funding from the state and from the feds, the reimbursement rates, the daily reimbursement rates, just don't go anywhere near meeting the cost of actually providing high quality care. And one of the things that we're really looking for is continuity of care, that once a child enters the system at any age from 0 to 5, that we will guarantee funding for that family to receive services from whenever they enter the system up to when they enter kindergarten. There's been so much churning in and out of eligibility and different subsidy funding sources for families and requirements that we've seen that families lose subsidies or lose access, and then there's a gap, and then the child, loses their services, and then we have to the family starts all over again. And so we're trying to really minimize that completely by saying, once you're in our system, once you're eligible, you get our funding, we will guarantee that we will follow you all the way up to kindergarten. We do have target populations, priority populations that we are working with, that's really focusing on. Low-income African American and Latino families, English language learners, homeless families, children who are in the child welfare system, and children with special needs. We do, African American and Latino families, we are specifically calling out because we see a lot of those discrepancies in the kindergarten readiness in San Francisco, despite all of our investments and work towards minimizing that. We are seeing these differences in kindergarten readiness scores, and so we really want with Latino and African American families as opposed to Asian and white families. So that's why there is a priority for services in certain communities and within certain demographics. We really want to fully utilize the state and federal funding that's coming to the county. We don't want to leave dollars on the table. We want to use all of the state money that we get, all of the federal money that we get, because we know that our local dollars are way more flexible, and we can do a lot more with that. So we want to leverage those state and federal dollars. And like I said before, we really want to try to assist more moderate income families, because the state eligibility or the federal eligibility doesn't necessarily work for the reality of some of our families in San Francisco. So I won't go through all of this. I just want you to know that we have a citywide plan for early care and education. There was a huge community process. I think it lasted over a year, lots of feedback sessions, lots of forums. And that's our vision for where we're going as a city. We have a document that's our guiding star. I think the one thing I did want to highlight from this is that really the idea of going out into the community, doing lots of input sessions, meeting with provider associations, with the local planning council, First Five, or the Family Child Care Association members. We went out, parent voices. We got a lot of feedback, a lot of community input before we move forward with our early learning scholarship funding system. And that was launched just in July last year. So we're still in the first year of implementation. So it's been interesting. So this again is our sort of the citywide plan, our strategic framework that guides our work. You can see that the recommendations at the top around a birth to 5 approach, equity and diversity, quality improvement, family engagement, professional development and workforce, and the financing models. And the financing models specifically are our early learning scholarship, providing fairer rates to providers, and continuity of care for families. And that's what we'll be focusing on today. I think we already talked about this. Again, this is one of our overarching goals, is we don't want disqualifying circumstances or going over the income level for eligibility to be a barrier to continuity of care. So one of our real overarching sort of framework is you're in up till kindergarten, and no matter what. So how much does high quality ECE cost in San Francisco? Well, it might not. This is sort of our the overarching kind of idea behind what our early learning scholarship is. So we have center rates and we have family child care rates. And we had a comprehensive fiscal analysis that was done by a national team that came out to San Francisco. They met with center directors, teachers, families, family child care providers, to really look at all of the things that went into what it cost to provide early care and education services. That was I think a 9-month process where we did this really intensive CFA, and it's actually available on our website. It's very detailed. It's like 200 pages. And what we came up with were these benchmark rates for each age group within Center and FCC. So for infants, our annual rate would be for high quality, and our benchmark is Tier 3 of the state QRIS. So there's to be eligible to be an early learning scholarship provider, center, or family child care educator in our network. There was a guarantee that you were either already at Tier 3 of the QRIS, or for family child care, because there are some, that's the QRIS certainly is not as accessible, and it may require more time. There was a commitment to move towards Tier 3 at the QRIS for the family child care educators. So we're using Tier 3 as our baseline. So what would it cost to provide Tier 3 quality ECE in both centers and family child care? And for centers, for an infant, it was $27,476 a year. For a toddler, it's $20,935 a year. And for a preschooler, it was $17,069 a year. And we're already getting feedback from our network that that's not enough, that those rates are not enough and still don't match the cost of actually providing high-quality care in a county like San Francisco. So for some of our children in the city that don't qualify for any federal or state subsidies, we will provide vouchers, locally funded vouchers that would pay that full rate of those amounts up to that Tier 3 base rate. For for families that are receiving subsidies from Title V or Head Start or state vouchers, CalWorks vouchers, we will pay the gap between what the reimbursement rate is from the state up to the Tier 3 local rate. And that's sort of our gap funding to bring everybody up to that same amount per child. For Head Start, often they braid and blend funding with Head Start and Title V. Again, we'll bridge that gap so that it can bring it up to the San Francisco rate. So, also we have universal PFA that is not income based, and we still have tuition credit for families regardless of income for 4-year-olds who are eligible for preschool for all. So that's kind of our goal eventually is to get to tiered reimbursements for both Tier 4 and Tier 5 in the QRIS. We're not there yet because we don't have the resources to be able to do that currently. Sorry, this is a lot of those little things that I didn't put in, but there you go. So again, I think this is for you. You have this in your handouts. It shows you the rates. One thing I just wanted to highlight here, this is Center. Again, on our website, in our operating guidelines, you can find all the rates for family childcare and centers. But we do pay a 5% differential, even on the full day, full year rates for those programs that provide continuity of care from infant through 5-year-olds. So again, an incentive to serve the full range of infants, toddlers, and preschoolers, because infants and toddlers are the biggest unmet need for services in San Francisco. So, again, I mentioned that we really wanted to utilize state and federal funding. As part of our screening for locally funded services, we want to, we look to see if a family is eligible for any state or federal funding before they're fully reimbursed at our early learning scholarship rate. So we want to see if a family comes in to our resource and referral agencies, are they eligible for Head Start? Are they eligible for Title V? Could they be on a CalWorks voucher? If not, are they eligible for our early learning scholarship and we'll pay the full rate, as opposed to just the gap between the state or federal funding. You know what? We do have a pilot. We are a pilot county, so we're very lucky. We have 24-month eligibility, and 85% of the SMI is an entrance income. So that has made a difference in earning our state contracts. So I think I've gone through most of what was before and what we have with our early learning scholarships as far as reimbursement rates and continuity of care. You can see that the difference between the income for families, that at 85% of the SMI at $63,000 for a family of 3 is the cliff. With our 110% of the AMI, it's $103,000 for a family of 3. So it's a significant difference in earnings that a family could make and still be eligible for some form of subsidy for early care and education. And again, quality applies to all of our that accountability and quality insurances for all of the centers and FCCs that are in our network. So quality, have we seen any impact in what's been going on as far as, we have this requirement to participate in the QRS to be part of our system? And this is from First 5 San Francisco. The orange is 2014 and 2016, where this is both centers and family child care providers combined. And then the green is the 2016 and 2018. So you can see that we have none of our agencies that are within our network are in Tier 1. We have very few in Tier 3, but the majority of our programs are in Tier 4 and Tier 5. So we hope and we make some assumptions, but we think the investments that we're making in quality, TA, coaching, all the support systems that we have in place that are part of our network have access to, have made some significant improvements in our quality scores. And family childcare educators, we have 2 family childcare quality networks that are housed at our 2 resource and referral agencies. Again, we fund that through our office, and they provide the coaching and TA and direct involvement with the family childcare homes that are in those networks. And the family childcare homes that are part of our ELS program are required to be in the QN, the quality network, to get those services. Lessons learned, reimbursement rates should meet the actual cost of providing the care instead of 50% or less. Continuity of care is vital. Starting early is vital. Everyone talks about, instead of pre-K, we want to start as early as possible, and it's really vital to provide that support for 0 to 3-year-olds as well as 3 and 4-year-olds. Childcare cliffs, they need to be smoothed. Those edges just need to be smoothed so to make it easier for families. The existing subsidy systems, there's different ages, requirements for the between the vouchers and they have different age categories for infants, toddlers, and preschoolers, and it's just like it can get really complicated when you're trying to work within a fragmented system. A mixed delivery system is vital. We found that we work with, both with our family child care educators and our community-based organizations and our school district. Data has been, we really need a consolidated data to be able to do the work that we do in San Francisco, and that's an ongoing struggle for us, and we're working on that. It's challenging. That's there you go. That's a lesson learned. It's very challenging. Bright spots. We've improved the leveraging of state and federal dollars for eligible children because we're giving an incentive for programs to earn those dollars now and take those vouchers and use Title V dollars because we're paying the difference. Instead of getting a reimbursement rate that doesn't meet your cost of care and you're constantly in the red, we say we'll pay you more on top of that to serve those children. Continuity of care. And part of our system is e-signature, looking at electronic signature system across the board to capture that data really efficiently. We have had some bright spots with additional funding for our system, specifically homeless children and for infant toddlers. And we have a ballot measure going on in June to raise another $140 million for our ELS system, which would be amazing if that passes. It's been a massive system change in San Francisco, and that has not been without its rocky road this first year. I think we found that we moved from a funding per site model, that we had different strategies to address different areas of the field, something for compensation, something for infants and toddlers, something for quality. And what we've done is we've amalgamated all of those different funding streams into one early learning scholarship, which is a child-based a fee for service based on children enrollment. So that was a huge system shift, and change is difficult, and the programs that were being funded by the city when we brought in this new system, definitely there was some challenges to that change in how we were funding the services. We didn't have a very long timeline for planning and implementation, so we had a quick turnaround, so it all happened way too quickly. I think our services about enrollment for getting children in empty spaces in programs as quickly as possible. We were already building on a system that wasn't as efficient as we should have been. Our eligibility list, we still have a centralized eligibility list in San Francisco. We kept that on after the state defunded those, and so our system just wasn't ready for this new change in this funding system, and so we had some. The first few months, we weren't getting children in those empty spaces as quickly as we should have, and so that was a challenge. And again, the data systems, I think, have been challenging. So we're working on data systems. We're working on our new eligibility list. So that was quick. Sorry, I knew that we were kind of running out of time.
No, thank you. I'll start off with a few questions. I have the mic here, so I'll kind of blend this commission hat and my budget hat. So I oversee the budget subcommittee for ECE, and looking at the state preschool program and the rate structure and your families that are now in San Francisco. We've increased slots the last few years, as well as not marginally, but we've increased the rates last few years as well. So how's that sorting out in trying to find families that match the opportunity that we're putting out from CD for the state preschool program?
Oh, I mean, that's an integral part of our system. I mean, I think the majority of the programs that we work with, the centers that we work with in our ELS, our Early Learning Scholarship, are Title V programs.
I get that, but are you having trouble finding families, is what I'm saying? are you utilizing all the resources that we are giving you from the state? Some districts, some communities are saying we're having a tough time.
We're not, but we're doing better. And I think two of the things that I think that, we as a pilot county, we've been looking at the earnings of our contracts very, very closely over the last 12 years. And we've seen this year that we're doing better than we did last year. Two of the things, I think, one, the ELS, this reimbursement rate, this incentive to earn the contract because you're not getting the state rate. Is an incentive to enroll more children instead of taking. A lot of our programs are mixed income and have families that pay fees as well, and so reducing the number of family fee families, but taking more Title V or voucher children, for example, because we're paying on top of that. So it's not because the reimbursement rate from the state is encouraging them to do it, but because we're helping support them in meeting the cost of providing care. And then the other thing that I think has made a difference is some of the state policies that have changed recently. Statewide, we have 12-month eligibility. Once you're in, you're good for 12 months unless there's been a change, to the income level. And in San Francisco, we have 24-month eligibility, the same as the pilot counties. And so I think that again, that focus on eligibility and family, family eligibility, and taking that away a little bit, and it's been, you're good for a longer period of time, has meant that again that there's more opportunities for programs to use those the state funding.
Okay, and while you're here, you're a practitioner. We had our last hearing down in the desert, and we heard from the area down there, the Riverside School District, talking about the TK opportunities and state preschool, and how does San Francisco kind of manage that with if you have a kid that's born in March and so they're not eligible for TK, but they could be eligible mid-year. What are you doing there? Do you enroll them part year, and how does that work?
It's up to that's a family choice. It's like we will enroll a child for as long as they need to be before they go into the school district. But
do you enroll them in the state preschool program and then mid-year transition, or how do you do that?
We don't have a specific policy around state preschool and TK. Again, I think that happens. I think sometimes a family might start in a state preschool program and then realize that there's a TK program with spaces down the road, and they don't have to pay a fee there, for example, because it's in the school district. So again, I think that's a lot of parental choice. We don't give any instructions to our programs about what ages they
instruction, stop. But have you figured out how to braid the two to help the families, essentially?
No. The answer is no. Short answer is no.
Here we go.
Assemblymember, I have a 4.5-year-old who's turning 5 September 7th, and I can walk you through what an incredibly difficult and challenging, stressful process it is.
Yeah,
we don't have to do it now.
I know you mentioned that our last hearing too.
Yeah.
Commissioner Kong.
So you talked about how you've moved to quality standards that vary by setting, and then now it's the same high quality standards for all the settings. What have you learned about the workforce there? You mentioned compensation, you mentioned coaching.
Compensation is probably the biggest challenge that we have in San Francisco. Every meeting that we have with our grantees, every meeting that we go out to the community, there's a workforce crisis in San Francisco. We have classrooms that aren't open because programs can't find teachers to work in those classrooms. So compensation is incorporated. The wages were incorporated as part of the fiscal analysis as to what people. So instead of having a wage-specific initiative, which we used to have, we've sort of with a higher reimbursement rate per child. We thought that was absorbed in this new scholarship. What we found is that again we're just hearing that it's not enough. That the wages have gone up. We're looking at minimum compensation ordinances that would bring up the minimum wage with city-funded programs above the minimum wage of up to over $16 an hour. So everything we just can't keep up with what educators need to make and should be making. So in this new ballot measure that's coming out in June, if it passes, part of the language is around compensation for the educators that are part of our ELS. So we're increasing the reimbursement rates to specifically address that. But we do have a professional development piece. That's the work that we do. So it's very specific. We have a whole PD professional development work that's part of our office. That is a completely different, a system that we work with First Five. We work with our higher ed institutions. We work with the school district around access to our educators, the teachers, and the family childcare educators to trainings and workshops and ongoing education.
Thank you. Commissioner Ignatius? Were you finished? Deborah? Yeah.
Graham, since this is the financing conversation, I don't know, did you describe, these local dollars came out of a previous ballot initiative,
They
correct?
did, yes, but,
Yeah.
but we had a property tax set aside for our children's fund, and then which a portion of that goes to 0 to 5-year-olds. So that used to be housed at our Department of Children, Youth and Families, and the funding that's allocated to 0 to 5 is now under our house. Then First Five used to run our Preschool for All initiative, and that was funded by a general fund set aside, which is the Public Education and Enrichment Fund. Again, that funding was allocated over to our office to under one roof. And then we have some, we also administer some CalWORks, some state dollars, that's part of that, but the majority of our money is, and then we have general fund as well, some general fund. So it's 2 set-asides, general fund, and some state funding. We have a budget in our office of about $113 million.
And can you break down how much of that was these set-asides and local versus what state?
I should be able to, but
Okay.
I can't right now. But I can get that to you. I didn't. It was in the other PowerPoint that I took it out because I thought you wouldn't be interested in that.
Commissioner McMillan.
So I think what you have presented is remarkable, especially with what you guys have done in such a short time frame. I think it's amazing. I have a dream, not Martin Luther King's, my own. And I attend a lot of town halls, a lot of candidates running for seats and so forth. And I always hear them say, I want to make sure that families have jobs that they can go to and that their kids can get into whatever college they want to. But not once have I heard them say, I want to make sure that families have jobs that they can go to that pay them well and that their children and their babies can have quality early education and care. Not once. I think what you have here might change that conversation. I'm hoping that this would be the beginning of changing that conversation. And my dream is that I can go to a town hall and hear what I just said. Let's start at the beginning. Don't jump to the end. Start at the beginning. And maybe if we use that targeted universalism, then we don't have to have the teacher bring the children. We can have the children bring the teacher.
Absolutely.
But I'm so impressed with this, and I definitely want to learn more about it.
Come to San Francisco, we'll give you a tour.
Sure. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Olenek.
Well, I could ask a dozen questions, but I won't. The one that I'm really interested in is, as you sort of raise the rate, you talked about having trouble getting teachers and not having classroom open, but I'm wondering, you're seeing anything in terms of supply, or do you still have a lot of families that are using unlicensed care or other mechanisms?
So a higher percentage of families in San Francisco with vouchers are actually using licensed care than unlicensed. I mean, family, friends, and neighbors in San Francisco. What the next phase, to your point about family, friends, and neighbors, and what are we doing there? That's the next phase, and we've actually just put out some grant funding, for people to apply for, and for innovative ideas, and one of them is around working with family, friends, and neighbors, and maybe looking at a higher reimbursement rate for those family, friend, and neighbor providers who would like to do some quality workshops and to get some training and be part of a system and get a higher reimbursement rate to provide care for their children. So that's a next phase. This is still, like I said, this is our first year of implementation, and so it's we're learning as we go. But we also see that potentially. I think that could be a pathway for, I think that was mentioned before, for family, friends, and neighbors to maybe go into licensed care if they get a taste of it through some quality workshops and trainings. Yeah, I think we are lucky. We do have I think we have a pretty good supply. We're obviously not meeting all the need, and infant and toddler care and education is our biggest unmet need, and has been for decades. And so we really want to incentivize centers and family childcare owners to serve that 0 to 3 population. That's our biggest struggle. We're at probably 95% of preschoolers who are eligible, being more than 95% for subsidies, who are in some form of services. So we're doing very well with preschool.
Wow, that's remarkable.
Yeah, AIR actually reports 127%.
It's targeted universalism right here. So. Yes, Commissioner Boothie.
Graham, thank you. Always a pleasure to hear from you and figure out the fun stuff. As a San Francisco resident myself, I always like to hear what we're doing there as well. I'm curious about the competitive nature of the amount of funding that you're putting out. According to your chart, it's about $17,000, right, for a preschooler per year, which is significantly higher than the standard reimbursement rate currently across the state. How competitive is that to a private pay program?
It's not.
Nowhere close.
No, we've just looked at some. We have some information about what some private. We're recognizing that even our higher ELS or early learning scholarship rates aren't meeting some of the private pay rates in the city, and so we do have some private for-profit agencies that are part of our network who primarily serve private paying families, but want to serve some subsidy eligible families within our funding source. And we're looking at the differences, and we're not meeting the rates that they're charging their families. So even with our ELS, they're taking a loss with the rates that they would normally charge to serve the families that we fund. So we are seeing that we're not that competitive, as competitive as we thought we were.
Do you know about what percentage it is?
I don't, but I can get that information to you. I have.
Because that would be interesting, because I mean, certainly as we're looking at workforce issues, when we're looking at compensation, when we're looking at capacity issues, especially for 0 to 3, I think it'd be really interesting to know what the other going rates are and what percentage it is, even with this bump.
We have that information. I can get that. I'll be happy to share that with the commission.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. McCroskey.
So thank you, all three of you. Really interesting. Push my button. Yes. Very interesting confluence of presentations. Thank you all so much. But I really have to add a somewhat unusual compliment, Graham, which is that in LA we're very inspired by the work you're doing in San Francisco. And we're in particular inspired by the idea of really generating a comprehensive financial analysis. We've been doing some counting of state and federal subsidy funds that come in, that flow into our county on a regular basis, but we're not including everything. And we don't have the history of local investment that you do, but we've got a lot of investments out there, and coordinating them is not a bad thing to do, right? So we're actually already in discussion with the same team that you use for your financial analysis.
Glad to hear that. That's great.
And it's just a really wonderful shot in the arm for us to be able to say they did it in San Francisco, even though we got more than one city and more than one school district and so forth and so on. But it's really inspiring and very, very helpful to hear your updated report about what the sort of next challenges are.
Great, thank you.
Commissioner Campos Rivera.
Thank you for your great presentation. Just out of curiosity, when both the set aside, the initiatives were put in the ballot, and I'm not even sure what year, 2016.
Well, they were actually they were both what's the word? Rebooted. No, it's not the word. But anyway, they were reauthorized recently in 2016. Both of those set asides that I mentioned under one Children and Youth Fund.
Can you tell me a little bit of what your communication strategy was for your general audience, for them to understand just your average family to understand the importance of investments in early childhood education, commercials? What did you hear that really?
It was a very grassroots effort. I would say that San Francisco is a very political city, and it was grassroots. It was being at the BART stations, it was being on the Muni stations, it was parent voices, it was the educators, the Family Child Care Association. People really rallied around and got the message out there. And I have to say, even though we may have a small child population in San Francisco, we tend to be a pretty liberal voting city that support children and youth initiatives. And so I think we have a very a population there who are open to that, even if they don't have children themselves, see the value in that. But yeah, I mean, as a city agency, we're not able to do that advocacy ourselves. So I think it fell on our R&Rs, our centers, our parents in those programs to go out and get the word out.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Appreciate your contribution. Okay, with that, we will go now to the third part of our agenda, the subcommittee reports. But before we do that, we just wanted to run through a few slides on overall, kind of what we were launched to do in the first place, as the speaker alluded to. So it's up there on the PowerPoint, of course, but this commission's vision was aspirational, looking at basically the long-term systems, programs, and financing, steps in the immediate and short-term, funding issues, federal, state, and local, and the role of philanthropy in business. Of course, what we wanted to look at what the system should look like for providers, teachers, families. Appreciate the discussion today on equity and disparities. Again, financing what the state could provide as well as what's needed to make sure we have high quality programs meeting our needs, infrastructure, facilities, compensation, certain issues that we're looking at. And then we also, when we began this process, after a meeting or two, really wanted to focus on how we could dig a little deeper in some of these issues. So we introduced the idea of having subcommittees, digging more specifically into topics of financing and economic impact, access, workforce, and meeting the needs of families. And again, the subcommittee tentative plan is this past spring developed an outline on the issues, the areas for discussion, and hopefully coming close towards where we went ahead with recommendations and a process from now until October, developing the draft recommendations, November and December, cost estimates, phase-in implementation, and then in 2019, January and March, a report coming out. We'll review that, have a review with stakeholders, state agency staff, as well as providers throughout the state of California, and have a final draft. And I will note this will be right about the time we'll have a new governor to the state of California. So we think it's a very timely approach, and hopefully that could serve us well as we look to expand EC in 2019 and beyond. Okay, so with that, we will hear from our 4 subcommittees right now, and we will start with the subcommittee on financing and the economic impact of EC.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll be reporting on this today. I am one of the members, but we have our 2 co-chairs, Nina Boothie and Sonia Campos Rivera, who may jump in and add. But so timely because, as evidenced by the presentation earlier today, we have done a lot of research on the National Academy of Sciences report, not just today, but obviously some of us, I worked on the committee, on the National Committee, and some of us have taken the pieces apart and have been discussing it, and we will continue to look at that. The other is the Learning Policy Institute report, as well as the labor report from UC Berkeley. Can we go to the next one? Okay. Then creating a financing structure that ultimately incorporates the recommendations of all of the other committees, because we need to look at what are we going to need in terms of the workforce, what are we going to need in terms of providing access, and again, whether it's targeted universalism or universalism, and then what are we going to need in terms of funding the engaging families to support their children in the care and education of their infants, toddlers, and preschoolers. So identifying dedicated funding sources for a well-funded system, and you've heard a lot of that in the previous presentations, that we need to look at what are the local, state, federal dollars, but as well as potential private funding sources. Looking at the priorities for initial investment, you've already heard we're not thinking about this in 1 year, but that it will take us time to get there. So what is it that we need to do first? How do we meet the needs of the families and children to ensure equity? And you've heard from many of the presenters and the members up here of the commission that a big gap is in the infant toddler area. So we've been having a lot of the discussions is where do we start first? So we need to look at that. What do we need to do to compensate our family child care providers because they're the least compensated at this particular time. So we're looking at the prioritization for the funding. Then you already heard the presentation, and we're exploring the targeted universalism as a potential framework to look at our future work. Definitely looking at the governance and systems change, including the reimbursement rates, because you heard even for people who are doubling down on their local dollars, it's not enough. So what do we look at that? What about the coordination of any and all other systems? So we need to make sure that coordination and collaboration are part of the design that ultimately our elected officials will look at. And then we are looking at integrating parent leave for parents as part of our recommendations, because part of the early care and education comes first from the parents. That's where it starts. So I will turn it over to Mary.
Okay. I am going to be giving you just a report from our Expanding Access Subcommittee, and sort of I kind of alluded to it earlier with our conversation about targeted universalism, but we are really, I think for a long time when we've talked about access, it's really been about what the unmet need is and trying to meet that need. But beyond just actual funding for more resources, for more services, we do want to also look and understand what are the barriers for families today when it comes to race, immigration, language, geography, because just getting to the door of the agency that's going to help you get the assistance could be a full-time job and a lot of landmines in between. And so we want to really just try to understand what those are. We want to look at just unique populations, families who are experiencing homelessness, deep poverty, children with special needs, children who are engaged in the child welfare system. And again, just in order for us to get to universalism, we do need to recognize that not all families are going to get there at the same time or in the same path. And so to make sure our recommendations reflect that. One of the ways that we will be doing that is a survey that we're sending out to the field, and particularly to sort of service providers and entities who really understand these unique special populations to help inform what recommendations go forward. We've discussed the possibility of doing a needs assessment as part of the recommendations. We sort of, we have a lot of experts on the commission, but we need to know what families in 2018 need, when they need care, how they need care, what they see as quality, and all of those things. And we'll be, doing a landscape analysis of our eligibility requirements, making sure systems are speaking to one another, looking at the facility needs, and really making sure that in order to be true to our mixed delivery system, that we are not leaving anybody out, and that centers, family child care, and family friend and neighbor care each play a significant piece to our system. And I think with that, I'm passing it to Deb.
So I'm reporting on the Workforce Retention and Development Subcommittee. The co-chairs Celia Ayala and Tanya McMillan, and then another member, Sonia Campos Rivera. These are some of the pieces of research that we've been looking at, but we've been looking at many national studies as well as California's to get that state context. So we're looking at a range of topics, but overall, just to ensure that we have a high-quality workforce that's diverse, that's effective, that's well compensated, and professionally supported. And one focus is, of course, the compensation. So we're looking at compensation and really compensating our workers as the professionals that they are, who play a critical role in young children's development. We're also looking at competencies, so competency-based professional preparation for the workforce. Fourth, we're looking at training and preparation, so increasing practitioners' knowledge and the competencies through higher education programs, through credentialing and other forms of professional learning. We want to make sure that there is ongoing professional development, that it's sustainable, that it's consistent and coherent, and that includes favorable working conditions like paid release time. And then the last two have to do with diversity and inclusiveness. So first, diversity across settings, so including family, friend, and neighbor caregivers, and ensuring that we have a diverse workforce that really reflects the children that it serves. And I'll turn it over to the engaging and meeting the needs of families.
Thank you. Following the format of the other subcommittee presentations, we provided a few of the resources that we've been looking at, and one of the ones that may be the most unusual is a book, actually, research book, but it's very, very well done about how parents benefit from the advice of other parents in their same situation, and that child care programs bring parents into proximity with each other, and they can share information not just about child care, but about all kinds of other things. So there's that, and then there's more how do institutions support and engage families. But I think the piece I want to tell you about, because I'm so excited about it, I think all of us are excited about it, is that we have a plan for doing focus groups with parents in different parts of the state, so that we're going to get to collect qualitative data from parents in a whole variety of places, using a whole variety of programs, and with a variety of experiences, so that they can tell us how this looks to them from their own experiences, both what have been the successes and the benefits, but also the challenges of negotiating an extremely complicated system. And so we're expecting that we're going to have results, maybe not the final report of results, but some results from that in the fall, which is wonderful because it can, as you've been hearing, it will inform, I think, recommendations throughout the report. To actually hear how people use our existing child care system and where they see the biggest challenges, and also helping to identify where they get their information. Because it is a really complex system. All of our systems are way too complicated, probably for families who are facing multiple challenges and with young children, but it is difficult to negotiate. So we're also looking at what are the roles of informal community-based groups can play in terms of helping parents get connected and understanding where resources and information is. So it's as I say, we're all very excited about the fact that we're going to be able to hear from many parents, and not just from a couple in this format, but that we're going to be able to develop forums that are really designed to get the best information we can from the people who actually know this system right now better than anyone else.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any questions for any other committee reports? Seeing none. We'll proceed now with public comment. If anybody is here to talk to us, share your ideas.
Good afternoon. I'm Tracy Patterson with California Food Policy Advocates, and I appreciate the opportunity to bring up something that hasn't been discussed when it comes to financing childcare, and that is food. Food is central to caring for children. I can tell you firsthand as a former Head Start teacher and parent to young children, food is not optional when it comes to taking care of kids during the day. But at the same time, it's something that keeps being seen as a nice to have extra in the state budget, as opposed to something that is core to the business of taking care of kids during the day while their parents are at work. And so I really want to emphasize to the committee just how important it is that we have an adequately funded child care food program in California. Since we cut state funding during the recession, we have not gotten it back. And child poverty rates at this point are still higher than they were in 2007 before the recession. Families haven't recovered while the state economy has. And so it's really critical that we restore the state supplemental funding to the child care food program, because when child care providers don't have that program, they just pull from other parts of the funding. They're pulling from their provider rates because food isn't optional. When they don't have the program, they make it work regardless. So I really want to make sure that that is something that is being thought of as part of the full picture of both the business model of childcare and what children need during the day.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mary Jane McGuire Fong, and I'm here representing PEACH, which is an advocacy group looking at integrating the higher education community in support of quality program, early childhood programs. I want to speak somewhat broadly to what we heard today. What an incredible hearing, and thank you for putting this together. And I hope it is listened to widely across the state on the streaming service. I want to begin by saying thank you for including the issue of parental leave in the discussion, because if we can include parental leave as we talk about the early childhood quality, workforce compensation dilemma, et cetera, we're going to tackle some of the financing questions. The question that I always work with is when we're thinking about the full range of services that we're talking about, birth to 5 here, the question that I always think about is, what do babies ask of us? And if you look at the research, and I understand Ross Thompson from UC Davis was with you a couple of times before, looking at the amazing competence of babies to learn. They ask of us the same thing that 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds ask of us. They ask one thing: are you there for me to support my incredible, amazing capacity to learn? They would like to be close to familiars. So that's how we get into this complex question of who are those familiars to the baby and to the family. So we have to be present to the questions that you ask about the family child care providers within our system and the people who are next door to the family so that they have access. These are complex questions, but from the bigger perspective that Lynn Carolla began with, how do we think about the workforce and the issue of baccalaureate degrees for those people preparing to do this work? We can get there if we keep all of these questions in the mix, which is what you are doing. PEACH and other higher education groups have been working tirelessly in California to figure out the question of workforce preparation for early childhood education. It's really complicated. The answers are not clear yet. Yet, one issue is clear: we need rigor. We need rigor. We can't give on rigor. And whether somebody is a teacher or a family child care provider serving infants and toddlers, they need to be paid well, but they also need to be prepared well. And so looking at ways to do a system that is going to be complex. In San Francisco, my God, you're really, leading the way on tackling complex questions. But I honestly believe we can get there in the name of quality care. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and just, I didn't say it earlier, but if you can try to keep it to a minute or two. There's not a huge line, so we'll be a little bit generous, but thank you.
Hello, my name is Charlotte Neal, and I'm a child care provider in Sacramento County, and also a union member of UDW and CCPU. While collective bargaining was not discussed in today's hearing, I would like to take the time to say child care providers across the state need the right to collective bargaining so we can better meet the needs of the children we care for and their families. With the help in the right collective bargaining, we can work together as a family child care advocate to improve access to high quality and affordable child care for all Californians. We need early childhood education recognize the important work it is. Collective bargaining will give us a seat at the table so we can better advocate for ourselves and for our families. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Hannah Melnick with the Learning Policy Institute. First, I just want to thank each of you and the presenters today for taking up these important issues and as Commissioner Ayala said, really trying to be innovative. I brought and shared copies of our reports with you on California's early learning system, which we appreciate the Finance Committee is already taking up and starting to look at. And we just want to say that we're happy to talk with you more about what we recommend. For example, providing programs on a sliding fee scale, reforming reimbursement rates, facilities supports, and contracts so that we have an adequate supply of licensed providers, having dedicated funding for professional learning for all educators, and making the system more accessible, for example, through an online portal for families and providers. We also want to flag for all of you that at the Learning Policy Institute, with others, we're working on looking at some of the costs of these recommendations. So I'd really like to share some of that work with you, hopefully soon, before I add to the unmet need for infant care. And we look forward to engaging with you and really hope that it will be a valuable resource, especially as you prepare for your final report. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Peter Barth from First 5 LA. And as I hope you hear at every single Blue Ribbon Commission meeting, not only on behalf of First 5 LA, but all First Fives, we're ready to roll up our sleeves and support you in any way possible. We believe firmly in the success of the Blue Ribbon Commission and how important it is that this commission's work succeeds. We applaud the Commission's conversation around financing, a really critical and much overlooked component of how we expand access to early learning in California. We urge you in the First Five community to be bold and ambitious. For too long, our approach has been merely targeted, including through the limited funding in First Fives, and now is the time to have a really bold vision for what an equitable system would look like. We also applaud the conversation around targeted universalism. It is an approach that in First 5 LA we endorse wholeheartedly. And we believe that if other countries and other states can do this, we can do it here in California. And we look forward to working with you as you roll out your work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Kate Miller with Children Now, and just want to express our appreciation for the big picture vision of financing an ECE system that will more equitably meet the needs of our children, and the more nuanced, detailed discussion about cost determining factors like livable wages and, of course, quality supports. And we heartily express the need to go beyond the status quo, and we know that the costs cannot be understated. Particularly given our population, we know obviously extraordinarily diverse and predominantly low income. So we really need to ensure that the programs that we're talking about are of quality, and that they're going to produce the outcomes that we tout, that we advocate for in our work. And also just echoing some of the discussion that came up today, we really encourage that aggressive thinking about the role of the state in providing childcare and early learning services. The question of governance can't be separate from the question of financing. And so it's really not just like, what is it going to cost, but what are we paying for and who's accountable for making sure that it's delivered and implemented. And then just also want to heartily agree that there's this ultimately a need for a methodical, meaningful transition plan, really to get us to point A to point B over a period of years. And then we need to take into account various scenarios that factor in changing economy, potential new revenue sources, and other factors. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Christina Negrelli. I am Senior Director of Programs for 0 to 3 here in California. This is the third meeting that I've had the pleasure of attending, and I just want to commend you on the incredible progress that you're making. I was so excited to hear the updates from each of the work groups and just see how well aligned they are with our mission at 0 to 3 to ensure that all babies and toddlers have a strong start in life, including quality and affordable childcare, but also time for parents to bond with their babies, also noted as paid parental leave, healthy emotional development, and strong physical health and nutrition. Another piece that's really important to hold on to is that every baby has an important story to tell, and that something that we learned from our National Parent Survey is that while parents understand and recognize the importance of early brain development and early learning, they often miss the mark in thinking that those critical time periods for the brain and that development occurs when a child goes to kindergarten instead of during those first 3 years. So I just applaud all of your efforts, especially in really thinking about the needs of babies and toddlers and their families. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jake Ferrer with Council for a Strong America, representing law enforcement, retired military, and business leaders across the state. Thank you for all the amazing work you've done thus far, and thank you in advance for the work that you're going to continue to do. Know that you have, in the form of these leaders, unexpected messengers who have your back. They believe in increasing access to high-quality childhood education because it's a public safety, a national security, and citizen readiness issue. And again, thank you for all the hard work that you can continue to do. And if you need anything, we're here to support you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any comments from commissioners? Seeing none, I did want to note that when we started this Blue Ribbon Commission, of course, it's about the plan, the long-term plan, but we didn't get lost that some of us up here have other jobs as well. And so we wanted to use these commission meetings and the information gathered to help frame the issues today and tomorrow. And essentially, we're going to adopt a budget the next month here in California. Just note that our last hearing we had, Riverside, there was some ideas that came up as far as the state preschool program and braiding and eligibility. So we're taking some of those specific ideas and looking to implement them in this year's budget. So while we have our plan that we're looking to unveil a year from now, there is work that has come about this process that is helping us today. So thank you all for participating, and hopefully we'll have some good news on the budget when the next time we see you. And but overall, thanks again for another great hearing and for all of you participating, including the audience. Thank you.